This morning, I'm going to talk a little bit about one of Dogen's writings called Zuimonki, which I talked about a month ago to another Zen center. And Zuimonki is not the Shobogenzo, which is what we're familiar with as the main writing of Dogen. But Zuimonki, loosely translated, means record of things heard. And these were talks that he gave to his monks in the monastery, and they were recorded by his successor, Koen-Ejo, and then later published. So these talks are directed at monks in a monastery, although there's quite a bit of it is applicable to lay people. And it's a basic message that's important to all of us in our Zazen practice. So I wanted to mention that when I studied the 16 Bodhisattva precepts with my teacher, my Shishin Roshi, he emphasized that the precepts are not rigid rules, but that they depend upon conditions, which and these conditions are, the time, the place, the people involved, and the intensity of the situation. And conditions change from century to century and from country to country. And one of the virtues of Buddhism is that it has been able to adapt to these conditions. And now Zen has taken root in the United States and other Western countries. So the soil's quite different from a Japanese Zen monastery of the 13th century, which is when he wrote these words. But so some of the things we can see are just relevant to that time, but some of his teachings are universally relevant. One of the things that really impressed me the most about the Dalai Lama was when I read that he said that if the modern discoveries of science conflict with our Buddhist beliefs, we'll have to reevaluate our Buddhist beliefs. And I think that's extraordinary, being able to adapt to situations. I would find it very hard for creation to hear that coming from from the mouths of a creationist. They reject evolutionary theory and they have their own theories in order to conform with the Bible. And I even heard that there's a Bible land, I think somewhere in Tennessee, that has one of these dioramas of the Ark of Noah, and the animals are going 2 by 2 up the ramp of the Ark, and there's dinosaurs going 2 by 2 up the ramp of the Ark, side by side with mammals and others. But in our 21st century, most Zen practitioners are lay people rather than monastics. And even those who have been ordained as monks or priests, including myself and Mui, often live with a partner, have children, and work at jobs. And there are also as many women as men practicing Zen, which is quite a shift. And in this country, there are quite a few very well accomplished female Zen masters. Because in the old days, the women weren't allowed into the monastery. They often would camp themselves outside the monastery gates and sell tea, these famous tea ladies that appear sometimes in koans, and they would gather whatever crumbs of the Dharma that they could. So these are big evolutionary changes in our practice. And another one is that Americans cherish our individualism over service to community. And as a consequence, Americans are more concerned about their psychological health than were monks in the monastery. I mean, we can see the individualism in practice right now in Texas. As you know, many people have been without electricity and without water, and I've done a little bit of reading about it. And of course, the governor blames the wind turbines, which froze up, but actually it was the gas lines that froze up, and people have warned them about it for a long time. But you know, in Texas, the utilities are privately owned, and they did that so to avoid government regulation. They didn't want the federal government regulating their utilities in Texas. So that's individualism. This is because the people who own the utilities would make more money that way. And now we see the consequences of it. And talk about individualism, I don't want to single anyone out in particular, but I will. Look at their Senator Ted Cruz. What did he do while all of his constituency, these are the people who voted in, were suffering? He hopped on a plane to Cancun. But there were other people, politicians, who were busy, you know, trying to make sure that the people who were suffering there had water and heat. You know, again, I won't mention names, but the fellow who lost to Ted Cruz in the last election for senator, and even people from out of state, some of the most reviled politicians from the right, you know, like Alexandria Cortez raised $1 million, you know, to help the people in the state of Texas, even though she's from New York. So this individualism is really something that is important in the history of our country. But there's a saying in Japan that a nail that sticks up is the one that gets hammered down. And if you've ever been to Japan, I mean, they're very much into harmony in the community and families, but they have a structure that supports that. And for some people, it seems like it could be a rigid structure, but we praise individual success in our country. You know, we always say he's a self-made person or she's a self-made person. Nobody's a self-made person. We depend on everybody else for everything that we do, everything that we need, everything we accomplish. Nobody can do it on their own. You know. So when I started practicing Zen, it was more than 50 years ago, I was told not to bring personal issues to my Roshi in the private, in the Dogen room. And I also read it in the Three Pillars of Zen, which was the first book on Zen practice, and it's published back in the 1960s. So I never brought personal issues to my teacher. And when I started to teach, that's all the students brought to me. They had problems in their love life, problems with their parents, problems at work, problems with other members of the Zen community. And I asked Bernie Glassman, who was the senior student at the Zen Center of LA at the time, and where we were training, and I said, "What's going on?" And he said, "It's clearly that's what's on their mind when they meditate. People are sitting there meditating, you know, treating all of these problems like koans, all these personal problems. Not exactly like koans because they're obsessing over them. But it wasn't going to go away. And so if I was going to be a Zen teacher, I had to learn how to handle it. And over a period of several years, and with Roshi Shinko, we developed a technique for dealing with emotional and psychological issues based on our meditation. And it's all laid out in our book, The Great Heart Way, which was published. I looked it up in 2006, 15 years ago. But Dogen doesn't talk about emotions. If a monk's emotions or psychological state interferes with his duties in the monastery, he was just expelled. That's how they dealt with it. But monks could be expelled for other reasons as well. I recall a story about a group of monks who were going on their begging rounds. And they walked in a line wearing large straw hats. Maybe you've seen pictures of it. And the hats hid their faces, and they carried their bowls. And when people put things into their bowls, it was not something that was personal. And on this particular day, they passed a farmer whose ox cart was stuck in the mud and he couldn't extract it. So one of the monks broke ranks and helped the farmer free his cart. And then he hurried to his place in the line of monks. Upon returning to the monastery, the monk was expelled for breaking the discipline and allowing his mind to wander from his practice as a monk. And I don't remember where I read about this, but in the commentary, the abbot was highly praised for maintaining discipline in the monastery. As you know, discipline in Zen monasteries can be very harsh, and our ancestors would stop at nothing to attain enlightenment. And in Zuimonki, Dogen says, students of the way, you should not think that we will practice the way on another day. Do not just spend this day or this moment in vain. Simply practice diligently, day by day, moment by moment. Now, when I first heard this story about the monk who helped the farmer and then was punished, it bothered me. And years later, I asked Bernie Glassman what he thought about it, and he said, it's terrible. I'm glad he agreed. It's his Zen work, was socially engaged Buddhism, helping people who are in distress. So in Zuimonki, though, Dogen does have a nice story. And I'll quote it. On some important points, the mental attitude of a person of the way is different from that of common people. Once, while the late superintendent of monks of Kenenji was still alive, the temple ran out of food. At that time, a patron invited the superintendent of monks to his home and offered him a bolt of silk. The superintendent rejoiced, tucked it under his kimono, and carried it back to the temple by himself without having his attendant take it for him. He gave the silk to the temple officer in charge and told him to use it to pay for the next morning's gruel and so forth. However, a certain layman made a request saying, an unfortunate thing has happened and I need 2 or 3 bolts of silk. If you have even a small amount, could you kindly let me have it? The superintendent of monks immediately took back the silk from the temple officer and gave it to the layman. At the time, the officer and other monks in his assembly were puzzled by this unexpected action. Later, the superintendent of monks himself said, "You may think what I did was unreasonable. However, I think that all of you monks have gathered together here because of your aspiration for the Buddha way. None of us would mind even if we ran out of food or even starved to death. It is more beneficial to help people living in the lay world who are suffering right now from a lack of something they need. Even for ourselves, it's better to give up one day's food and help others suffering. And then Dogen commented, this is the deep consideration of a person of the way. Let's reflect on it for a moment. So Dogen addresses how the barrier of illness can be used to limit or prevent us from practicing. He says if we think that because we're physically sick, we will practice better only after we have recovered from the sickness, it only shows that we lack the mind of awakening. And then he continues, an ancient once said, do not spend your days and night in vain. If you receive medical treatment to heal a sickness, but instead of getting better, the pain gradually increases, we may think that we should have practiced while the pain was not so bad. However, when we are in pain, we should be determined to practice before a condition becomes critical. When our condition has become critical, we should resolve to practice before we die. Back in the 1970s, I was a close friend of Joko Beck, who became a very popular Zen teacher prior to her death in 2011, 10 years ago now. And Joko started her meditation with a group of middle-aged women who heard my Zuimonki talk at their Universalist or Unitarian church. She told me that at first they would sit for 5 minutes and then talk for about an hour about how difficult it was. One of their group was a woman named Shirley Sison, who realized the meaning and intent of Zen before the others. Unfortunately, Shirley became quite sick with cancer. And Joko was with her in the hospital as she was dying. And Joko told me that the calm and radiance of Shirley while she was dying was a major factor that encouraged Joko to continue her Zen practice until she died. The point is that no matter if we're sick or healthy, old or young, male or female or fluid, brown, black, or white, it is our own faith and resolve and longing that is essential to realize this great mystery. A number of Dogen's comments in this one section of Zuimonki are relevant to the present situation in our divided country. He said, in the mundane world, most people think and make judgments based on their self-centered evaluations. The Black writer and educator and activist Ibram Kendi wrote that the roots of white supremacy is self-interest. It was interesting to me when I read it. He said it's not hatred, it's self-interest. And it's self-interest that drove the rioters who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. And former president, numerous lies arose from his self-interest. And everyone who supported him or supports him now does so out of self-interest. But the far right does not have a lock on self-interest. It appears on the far left and in the middle. And from a Zen perspective, we can say that when one's self-interest is the same as communal interest, then Dharma relations are complete. So Dogen wrote in Genjo Koan, to study Zen is to study the self. And when we study the self, we clearly see that everything we do is out of self-interest. And if we examine the nature of self even more carefully, we see that there is no fixed abiding self. So what is the self in this self-interest? We base all of our thoughts and actions on a phantom, a delusion, and a chimera. The most pernicious attachment in our practice and in our life is the attachment to the idea of self. The single root of all of our mental afflictions and our inability to penetrate deeply into our practice is the ignorance that identifies events and objects as being independent and then grasps at these phenomena. It's called self-grasping ignorance. One of the aims of our practice is to dissolve that self-grasping ignorance. It's not to make oneself empty or blank, but to examine and investigate the nature of our ignorance that is grasping onto the concept of self. Upon being enlightened, the Buddha exclaimed, "How wonderful! Everyone without exception has the wisdom and virtue of the Buddha." Excuse me. It's only due to their attachments and deluded thoughts that they don't realize it. The Buddha mentioned deluded thoughts as a barrier to realizing Buddhahood. Deluded thoughts are dualistic thoughts. Dualistic thoughts create a sense of self and other. Good and bad. The Buddha also, upon being enlightened, said that I and all beings everywhere have simultaneously attained enlightenment. In other words, I and all beings everywhere are not separate. There's no dualism. So that if we realize that, then self-interest becomes other interest as well. Belief in a unique separate self that abides is a source of dualistic thoughts. We separate everything according to what promotes that self and what denigrates that self. An ancient philosopher once visited the tyrant of Syracuse in Sicily. The tyrant told him that all of his plans for the future, his schemes, and projected conquests, and finally said to the philosopher, "After all of this has been accomplished, after I've built the city, declared war on Messina, and as well as all of the other countries, and have conquered them all, then I shall settle down and be happy." And the philosopher said, "Why don't you settle down now and be happy?" So the question is, what is it that prevents us from being happy right now? What are we holding on to? What are we creating that's extra? Socrates believed that the wise person would instinctively lead a frugal life. He himself would not even wear shoes. Yet he constantly fell under the spell of the marketplace and would go there to look at all the wares on display. When one of his friends asked why, Socrates said, "I love to go there and discover how many things I am perfectly happy without." You never bought anything, you just go and look. We call it window shopping, right? But don't go window shopping just to see all of the various things that are available that we're happy without. We say, oh my gosh, I sure would like to have that. Dogen also wrote that attaining the way does not depend upon whether our faculties are sharp or dull. Every one of us can realize the Dharma, depending upon whether we're diligent or lazy. There is slowness or quickness in attaining the way. The difference between being diligent or lazy is caused by whether our aspiration is firmly established or not. Lack of firm aspiration is caused by not considering impermanence. We die moment to moment. Now we might think that everybody can attain the way but me. I used to think that. As some of you know, when I heard my teacher, my Shishin Roshi, say that, and I'd say, "Do you mean everybody?" And he would just say, "Sure, sure, sure, everybody." And again, this depends upon whether we're lazy or diligent. Here's a story I heard. One day, God took the form of a human male in order to walk through the world and see how her children were faring. He soon came upon an old ascetic who had been spending his entire life in severe bodily mortification and forceful mental disciplines. The ascetic had gained a certain degree of clarity of his senses from his prolonged practice and realized that the man casually walking by his cave was fully established in awareness of the inner divine. Painfully unwinding his body from his rigid posture, the ascetic bowed before God and said, "Great souled one, I perceive you are an illumined master. Pray tell me, honorable sir, how long will it take me before I realize my inner divine nature?" God smiled warmly and laughingly replied, "You're doing very well. At your present rate of progress, you will realize your inner divine self with just one more lifetime of similar effort." The ascetic, terrified and shocked, cried, "Another lifetime of this horror? How can I endure the boredom, this agony, this pain for another day? Let alone another lifetime. How horrible. You have cursed me this day. Be gone from this place, you impostor. Never would I believe such as you." God smiled lovingly at him and walked on. Soon coming upon a simple woman splashing in the river, laughing and singing. The woman's primary activity every day was to cry out, "God, how I love God. God, I love God. God." This foolish one never took the slightest care of her physical needs, never cared if she were fed, clothed, housed. She never noticed if she were clean or dirty, hot or cold, wet or dry. She might have been locked up in a padded cell in our modern age, but in those days people saw she was harmless and therefore tolerated her and occasionally gave her a crust of bread or some old half-rotten fruits or vegetables to eat. The simpleton was attracted by the radiance of this handsome stranger and came out of the water, bowed to him, and said, "How wonderful! God sent this great souled one. I've been enjoying myself so much of late. I've nearly forgotten that I have a goal. I began my quest to realize enlightenment long ago, but of late I've been distracted by this constant joy welling up inside. Seeing you just now reminded me of my journey, and I was wondering if you could tell me how long it would be before I realized my inner divine nature." God smiled warmly and laughingly replied, "You're doing very well. At your present rate of progress, you will realize your inner divine nature with just 70 more lifetimes of similar effort." 70 lifetimes of similar effort, cried the simple woman with perfect joy. "How wonderful! What a flawless boon you have bestowed upon me today." She was so filled with joy at the prospect of another 70 lifetimes of such bliss that the last doubt fled from her mind. Her last question melted into the joy that was her life. Her ignorance was irrevocably crushed, and she attained the highest state of enlightenment instantly. Yesterday, I was talking to my brother, who's a couple years older than me. I'll be 80 this year. And we were talking about the factors of long life. Not that I don't feel like we've achieved it yet, but the factors of long life. And we had both read studies and which said that it's not your diet or your exercise or the amount of sleep or the amount of sex, but it has to do with your attitude towards life. And as the story shows, the woman was joyful that she only had to live 70 more lifetimes, and whereas the ascetic was horrified that he had to live one more lifetime. So I would say also in our practice, our attitude is important. How do we approach our practice, our zazen? Oh boy, another session. I get to sit 8 hours a day. Isn't that wonderful? Oh no, such pain. How can I tolerate it? And why am I doing this? The sun's shining today. I could be out taking a hike. Dogen said that students of the way, when we practice with a certain teacher and listen to the Dharma, we should listen thoroughly again and again until we have attained a definitive understanding. If we spend time without asking what should be asked or without saying what should be said, it will be our own loss. Teachers give responses to their disciples only when they are asked questions. Each of the characters in the story I told asked God a question. The ascetic did not like the answer, and the simpleton was overjoyed with her answer. But still, it's important to ask. And my late Dharma brother, Daido Lori, whom some of you knew or heard about, used to say that coming into Doksan with a teacher is like a ping pong game. If the student does not serve the ball, then the teacher cannot return it. So heart teacher, Maizumi Roshi, died over 25 years ago. There have been many times since his death that I've wanted to ask him questions that I did not ask when he was alive. So now I'm going to end my talk, but I'm going to allow some time for you to ask me questions. So if anybody has a burning question that they've been wanting to ask, now's the time.